Senator Whish-Wilson.
Thank you, President. My question is to Senator Cormann in his capacity as Acting Assistant Treasurer. The Senator may be aware that hundreds of Australians are facing the loss of their homes. Indeed, foreclosure today by the ANZ Bank because they are victims of unscrupulous financial advisors who leverage them into risky and complex management investment schemes such as Timbercorp. Did you meet with any of the victims of Timbercorp collapse in Parliament House yesterday? And does the Liberal government, the architects of management investment schemes in Australia, accept any responsibility for the catastrophic regulatory and policy failure now surrounding management investment schemes in Australia?
The Acting Assistant Treasurer.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The answer to that final question is no. And let me just make the general point. Here in Australia, we have a very good financial services industry. Australian financial products and services all throughout the GFC performed very well by global standards. Every now and then, there are bad apples in every industry, and whenever there is a bad apple, he ought to be prosecuted, he or she ought to be prosecuted, they ought to have the book thrown at them. Our expectation as a government, and of course the regulatory requirements that are in place right now and will continue to be in place in the future, require financial advisors to act in the best interests of their clients. That is an introduction into the Corporations Act, a statutory requirement that was introduced into the Corporations Act with bipartisan support. It is a requirement that continues to have our support and will have our support into the future. As far as I'm concerned, obviously government can't be behind every individual transaction in the private sector everywhere across Australia. What we need to ensure is that we have the right balance between consumer protection when it comes to our regulatory arrangements, while making sure that access to high-quality advice is affordable.
Senator Cormann, just resume your seat as Senator Whish-Wilson's on his feet. Senator Whish-Wilson.
Point of order on relevance. I asked whether the Liberal Party took responsibility for the catastrophic failure of MIS schemes.
There's no point of order. The minister is addressing the question, and the minister still has 46 seconds remaining. The minister.
Thank you very much. I couldn't have been more direct in my answer to that question. I said no right at the beginning to that part of your question, and you clearly didn't listen to what I had to say. You clearly just were jumping up with your predetermined. The senator was clearly just jumping up with his pre-organised point of order, making an assumption of what I was going to say rather than what I actually said. As far as we're concerned, we understand on this side of the Parliament that financial advisors, good financial advisors across Australia, fulfil a very important role. They help people with their financial health and well-being. They help people manage financial risks and maximise financial opportunities, but of course they are dealing with other people's money, so there ought to be an appropriately robust regulatory framework in place, but it's got to be one where you've got an appropriate balance between a high level of consumer
protections. Time's expired. Senator Whish-Wilson. Senator Whish-Wilson.
Following on from that answer, given it is obvious many financial advisors didn't have the best interests of their clients at heart, and that the culture and practice, not a few bad apples, but a culture of paying commissions on general advice has already forced many Australians, including the Timbercorp victims, to the edge of financial, mental and physical ruin, why is the government now so determined to amend the FoFA legislation to overturn bans on commissions for general advice?
The Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Firstly, I completely reject the assertion that many financial advisors have done the wrong thing. There are some that have done the wrong thing, and wherever they do, as I've said earlier, they ought to have the book thrown at them. But most financial advisors across Australia do a very good job for Australians, saving for their retirement every single day. Now, in relation to the allegation that we were somehow reintroducing commissions on general advice, I reject that out of hand. That is just not true. And if you had caught up with developments, you would have gone to read the ABC fact check, hardly an apologist for coalition policy, and you will see that the ABC fact checkers said in response to a similar assertion by Shadow Treasurer Chris Bowen that he was scaremongering and that he had his facts wrong. So, I mean, if you want to do a bit more research when you're putting your questions together, you would have found out that that particular assertion is completely false.
Senator Whish-Wilson.
Thank you, President. I'll be pleased when the senator puts his money where his mouth is. When will the government introduce legislation? When will the government introduce legislation to amend the future of financial advice laws And will you rule out the use of regulation to ensure the big banks and financial houses aren't forced to comply with the FoFA laws before July 1st?
The Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And clearly, again, Senator Whish-Wilson is not following parliamentary procedures all that carefully, because in relation to his first question, if he was aware of what was actually happening, he would be aware that such legislation has already been introduced into the Parliament and indeed has been subject of a Senate Economics Committee inquiry chaired by none other than my good friend Senator Bushby. And that committee inquiry, of course, reported earlier this week, and the government is currently considering the recommendations that were made in that report.
Order. Resume your seat. Senator Whish-Wilson.
President, I believe I'm being verbaled by the senator.
Order.
That wasn't the question
Order.
I asked. I asked whether he would be introducing legislation, whether he would be introducing regulations if he doesn't get his legislation through the Senate.
Order. Resume your seat. That's not a point of order. 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 The Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Well, I can't believe that Senator Whish-Wilson repeated that part of the question, because my answer was, could not have been more directly relevant when I said that in that legislation had already been introduced, is already in the Parliament. It is currently before the Parliament. There's been a Senate inquiry into the legislation, which of course reported earlier this week, which made recommendations on what possible adjustments the government might want to consider. Now,